we're studying in Joshua. We'll finish it up today. I don't know how much we'll get into James. I think we'll have a pretty good study in that. I've really just in the first couple verses learned a lot from the couple things that I was kind of surprised about that was mentioned in some of the scholarship. But anyway, we are in the 24th chapter, and verse 25 is where we're going to start today. And we're, if you'll remember last week, Joshua had made his proclamation that his family was going to follow the Lord, and he secured a commitment from the rest of the children of Israel that they were going to follow Jehovah also. And now we're at the point here in starting with verse 25 where they're making some provisions for the preservation of the covenant, and they're going to do a few symbolic things, and then after that we're going to see the end of Joshua's work here on earth, and we're going to bury him and kind of move on from there. So before we go any further, I'd like for Keith, if you would, lead our minds in prayer.
Heavenly Father, we come this morning thanking you, Father, for the united guest. Thanking you for the opportunity that you presented to us to come here this hour and to study from your word. We ask you, Father, to be with all the teachers and all the classes. We pray, Father, that your word is presented in decent and in order. And that we, as the students of these classes, take what we learn from the class, use it to be better servants to it. And most thankful for your Son Jesus, for the love that was shown. He gave his life for us. In his name we pray.
Okay, so let's look at verses 25 through 28. And it says, "And Joshua made a covenant with the people that day and set them a statute and an ordinance in Shechem. And Joshua wrote these words in the book of the law of God, and took a great stone and set it there under an oak by the sanctuary of Jehovah. And Joshua said to all the people, Behold, this stone shall be a witness to us, for it has heard all the words of Jehovah which he spoke to us. It shall therefore be a witness to you, lest you deny your God. And Joshua sent away the people, each man to his inheritance." So basically, we see here that Joshua has made another memorial and something to physically remind the people of the things that were promised. And in all of our studies through the Old Testament, making memorials was something that they did quite often to remind the people of particular events that were that had taken place, and to every time that they would see that, it would bring to their remembrance the commitment that that they had made to serving God. Now we see here, obviously, this stone was a pretty good sized stone. We don't know; it's not revealed to us how big it was, but it was probably pretty big. And obviously, it did not literally hear what the Word of God said, because stones don't hear anything. But it was Joshua here was kind of giving the stone some human characteristics. I think that's called a personification, is what he was doing there. So it was going to remain there in that place as a monument and a silent witness to the commitment that was made, and to remind that generation and the generations to come of the commitment that the children of Israel had made to Jehovah. So then once all of this was done, then he basically, we see here in verse 28, he dismissed the nations. And that was kind of his last official act as their leader. And he sent them, back to their different tribes, and for them to do the things that they had been committed to do and to follow the covenant. So, kind of from this point, we're going to see a transition in the history of Israel, because we're going to move from a situation where they're going into, after Joshua dies, they're going into a time where they didn't have a God-appointed leader. So it was going to be incumbent on the leaders of the different tribes to step up and remain faithful and do the things that God wants them to do, and proceed with the things that God wanted them to do, namely to go into the rest of the promised land and exterminate the Canaanites and doing the things that God had commanded them to do. And while they were doing that, obviously they were to obey the covenant. And later on we know that God would raise up some leaders, but at this particular time there wasn't any. So the children of Israel there, they were committed, and at that time they saw no reason why they should fail to possess the rest of the land. And we know from other writings in the Bible that this particular group of leaders, they were true to their word. They did the things that they had promised Joshua that they would do, and they kept their commitment to God. And as a result of that, God blessed them, and they pretty much had a pretty happy existence there in the promised land, until they kind of strayed away, and then they started having problems. So this was probably one of the best times for the children of Israel in the land, right here at the time when Joshua died. Any comments about those verses?
I guess it would have been the leaders, the elders, and these people's responsibility to go back and tell the tribe
Right.
about this stone,
Right.
about this covenant, because they would have no idea it was even there.
Right.
And I don't know how everybody, millions of people, would be able to see this stone.
Well,
I guess when they walked by,
when they came by, and it's just like we got the Washington Monument in Washington. Well, there's a lot of people that haven't seen it, but they know it's there, and what it stands for. So I could probably do the same, and maybe over one of the children of Israel's individual's lifetime, they may make a journey to there and see the stuff. But we really are not stressing how important it was for those leaders to go back and get all that information down through the channels to the rank and file, I guess is what you call it, and see into it that they followed this, because they had to follow it just as much as the leaders did.
they had to know the covenant.
Right. Right. And that put a lot of pressure on, especially on the priests, to make sure that they were doing the things that they were supposed to do. Good comment. Anything else we need to talk on those verses? All right. So here in verses 29 through 33, we're going to talk about the death and burial of Joshua and Eleazar. So let's start with verse 29. And it says, "And it happened after these things, Joshua the son of Nun, the servant of Jehovah, died, being 110 years old. And they buried him in the border of his inheritance in Timnath-Serah in Mount Ephraim, on the north side of the hills of Gash. And Israel served Jehovah all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders who outlived Joshua, and who had known all the works of Jehovah that he had done for Israel." So in these final verses here, we see the end of Joshua's life, the end of his ministry. And, there wasn't any great monument that was built to him. His monument was what he did and the impression that he left upon the people. And we see here that his influence was so good, and he had done his job so well, that all of the elders and the judges and all the officials, they followed the things that God wanted them to do all the days of their life. They followed through with what Joshua wanted done. And I tell you what, I don't know how you could get a better memorial than that. You have such an influence that they remember what you said, and they followed through, and they followed God and did the things that God wanted them to do. So here in this final verse, it kind of records the end of his life and his ministry. And of course, this terminated a very important and successful era in the history of the children of Israel. And I think we have to kind of underline successful, because they were very successful in the things that they did. And we see here that their success continued as long as the elders served Israel in accordance with the word of God, and followed the things that Joshua had revealed to them, that was revealed to him by God. Now, I think we could assume here that he probably died shortly after the events that we talked about, in the previous verses, when they renewed the covenant. And of course, living to be 110 years old, that's an accomplishment for anybody. And I think it's interesting to note that that was the same age that Joseph was when he died. And we can read about that in Genesis 15 and 26. Now, if you try to put this thing in a timeline, the scholars estimate that Joshua died about 1366 BC. And if you work that up through from Adam and Eve all the way up through, that's about the time that you would come up with. So God had really used Joshua, in a whole lot of different things. He was a warrior, he was a general, he was a leader of the kind of like being the president, and he did a lot of things. He had a lot of accomplishments in his life, and obviously God blessed him in the things that he did, and it was a pretty good life. I think another thing that we need to kind of glean from this is that when you look through this record of all these things that we've studied about Joshua, there was really God didn't record any moral blemish on him. He didn't commit any great sin. There wasn't any really major problem like Moses had, and Moses, he had a big problem, and as a result of that, he wasn't able to enter into the promised land. But we don't see anything recorded, any type of blemish like that with Joshua. So that's a good thing too.
A little extra note on verse 30 here. Greek translation of Joshua actually includes a little more information about what way they have been buried. Joshua.
Okay.
This, don't know about the accuracy of it,
Mm-hmm.
claims that Joshua was buried with the stone knives with which he circumcised the children of Israel at Gilgal.
That's interesting.
Yeah. Other translations don't say that.
Right.
This Greek translation.
Right. One of the commentaries that I was reading on this, it had a good quote I thought was pretty good. It says, "Perhaps the outstanding characteristic of the man Joshua was his unqualified courage." And he did have to have a lot of courage, because sometimes he had to stand up against the people, and obviously he was courageous in battle through all the things that that he had to do in all the wars that he had to fight. But really, probably the real success of Joshua probably lies in the spirit that he had, and his love for God. And we don't have any record that they had a tombstone or anything like that. But his memorial is he's written about here in the Bible. He's put among the greatest men that ever lived, and that's a pretty good memorial there in itself. And if you break it down to one thing, he served God from the beginning to the end, and that was a pretty good way to do your life. He influenced a lot of people and was a good leader.
Verse 31 is a good word for a tombstone. All the days that he was over Israel people following God. That's a good thing to leave.
For a leader.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. All right, so let's look at verse 32. "And the bones of Joseph, which the sons of Israel brought up out of Egypt, they buried him in Shechem, in a piece of ground which Jacob bought from the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem, for 100 pieces of silver. And it became the inheritance of the sons of Joseph." So, evidently the writer here, it included the record of Joseph's burial of his bones, because the book of Joshua is kind of a testimony to being faithful to God. Of course, we know that Joseph was very faithful to God also, and there's a lot of similarities in the life that Joseph led and the life that that Joshua led. And you think about it, they had carried Joseph's bones around for a long time. He died back in Egypt, and he'd been dead quite a while in Egypt before the Exodus. He went all the way through the Exodus. He went all the way through the wilderness. He went through all these wars that they had with the Canaanites. And finally, when everything is settled down, his wish was to be buried in the Promised Land, and true to God's plan, and because of his faithfulness, he got his wish, and his descendants got him back there, and they put his bones to rest there in the Promised Land. Now, we really don't know in the chronological order exactly when this happened, because if you kind of look at it, it's kind of out of place with the death of Joshua and the death of Eleazar. But somewhere along in this time frame, this event happened, and that was an important event for the children of Israel, and it needed to be recorded, because this burial fulfilled the promise that Joseph's heirs had made to him before he died, that they would bury him in Canaan. And we can read about that in Genesis 50 and 25. So again, God rewarded his faith by letting his final wish come to pass.
Yeah, it said that you go back to Genesis 50:25, that Joseph made them swear an oath.
Don't leave me here.
Don't leave me here.
All right, so let's look at the last verse here. It says, "And Eleazar, the son of Aaron, died, and they buried him in a hill belonging to Phinehas, his son, which was given him in Mount Ephraim." So Eleazar's death and burial here was also significant, because he was Israel's high priest, and he was kind of the co-leader there with Joshua. Joshua kind of led the temporal things. He was the military leader and all of that, but Eleazar was a spiritual leader, and the two worked together. They were a very good team working together, kind of like a commander and a deputy commander type of thing. And he played, even though there's not a lot written about him, it's obvious from what was written that he played a very important role in the things that went on in taking the Promised Land. And he was a very important person, not only because he was he was the high priest, and that's a very prominent and important position. And as Israel's high priest, it was important that there at least be some type of reference here, and kind of put his ministry to an end instead of leaving anybody hanging. So basically we finished the book of Joshua here with 3 burials. And obviously this part of Joshua was not written by Joshua. So, it was finished up, maybe by the person who translated it in and kind of, filled in the rest of the material. Because usually, a situation like this, the person who's deceased is not going to be, not going to be telling this information, because they're not there. So we have, some peaceful grave sites that testify to the faithfulness of God for Joshua and for Joseph and for Eleazar. And, they had a pretty full life. They lived in a foreign nation. They went all the way through the wilderness together, and established the children of Israel in the Promised Land. And it was, it wasn't all easy. But I think in the end, they would all, if they could come back and talk to us, they would tell us that it was absolutely worth all of the problems, because it just showed that Joshua kept his word to everybody involved, from Joshua all the way down to the lowest rank and file people in Israel. And we should be encouraged by the stuff that we've read in Joshua, that because it really shows the unfailing faithfulness that that God has for His people, and I think we can take that to heart. So, any comments or questions when we finish up?
You had two. Seemed like in that generation you had two great decision makers. Both of them died. Joshua and Eleazar.
Right.
I guess both of you Phineas, knew what had transpired.
Mm-hmm.
He carried on with it.
Well, and I'm sure that like any good leader, they've made some type of preparation, for things to continue on.
It doesn't tell us anything about Joshua having a successor.
No, it doesn't, and that's that, and he that could be a real problem, because now you've got there's not one central sphere of influence. It's all over the place now, but that's the way God intended it to be. So obviously it worked as long as that group of judges, were there. The problem when the next generation comes on, of course, sometimes the next generation is a problem.
Yeah.
And
it seems like all that would fall on Phineas.
Right.
High priest would be
right.
The main man.
Right. So he kind of kept everything going too. All right. Yes. 13.
Most scholars say about 1383 to 85.
All right. So now we're going to go into the New Testament. We're going to start studying. We're going to start studying James. So I got some introductory material before we actually get into it. So James, traditionally, this epistle, and this is an epistle, it's a letter, okay, is traditionally attributed to James, the brother of Jesus. Now, some of the older commentaries call him James the Just. I saw that several times. And the audience for this particular epistle seems to generally be considered to be the Jewish Christians who had been dispersed outside of Israel. Now we know just by studying the Bible that James was an extremely common name back in that time. And we also know that there's a number of early Christians that had the name James. There was James, the son of Zebedee, who was martyred around 44 AD. Then James, the son of Alphaeus, and James, the brother of Jesus. So there were three Jameses that were prominently mentioned in the New Testament. Now, of these, James, the brother of Jesus, had a most prominent role in the early church. And I think what we need to understand is that James wasn't initially a follower of Jesus, and he kind of got converted in the process and became one of the pillars of the church there in Jerusalem. And most of the ancient church fathers, they attribute the authorship of this letter to James, the brother of Jesus. And one of the ancient or old scholars was a guy named Origen of Alexandria, and he lived from 185 to 253 AD. And he was considered in his day one of the finest Christian scholars and theologians of his time. And he wrote extensively about the Epistle of James, and he identified the James as the brother of Jesus. And one of the interesting things that I kind of got fascinated with when I was studying this is there was a lot of books that did not make it into the canon of the Bible as we know it today. And one of the books that didn't make it into the canon was called the Gospel of James. And they called this an infancy gospel because it spent a lot of time talking about the Jesus as a child and how all this stuff came to be. And one of the reasons it didn't make the canon is there was a lot of contradictions in that particular writings that didn't harmonize with the rest of the Gospels and the writings of the apostles and things like that. But one of the things that I thought was interesting about this is, and we've talked about this before and in different times, obviously Jesus had brothers and sisters because it's revealed to us in the New Testament that he did. Okay. And we've also, and the comment has been made lots of times that, once Jesus was born, there wasn't a lot of mention of Joseph. So in the Gospel of James, it explained this, and basically what it said was that Mary was a servant in the temple as a child, and as she became older and started having woman functions, she could not work in the temple because it would make the temple unclean. And she had an excellent reputation, and they were trying to fix her up with a husband. So Joseph was, according to the Gospel of James, was quite older than Mary, and he had 4 sons, and one of the sons was James. And that, of course, we know the story of the virgin birth and all of that, but there was quite an age difference, and it kind of revealed that Joseph had died pretty early in Jesus's life. And I thought that was pretty interesting in there. But James, and this gospel that wasn't taken in was attributed to James, the brother of Jesus. And so there's a lot of evidence there that showed that James, the brother of Jesus, was the one who wrote the book. So like I said before, he was not a follower of Jesus during Jesus' time here on earth. We can read about that in Mark 3:21 through 35 and John 7:5. But eventually he became a influential and important leader in the church. And some of the disciples, I'm not sure I completely agree with it, they say that he was kind of a follower in the vein of Paul. Of course, we know that Paul initially persecuted the church. There's no record that James persecuted the church. He just didn't believe it. But later on he was converted, and he went into it full bore once he became a Christian. So we know that James was a witness to the resurrection of Jesus, and this was probably one of the events that solidified his commitment to being in the church. And we know that Peter singled him out among the other Christians there following Peter's release from prison in Acts 12 and 17. And James also made a very important speech at the Jerusalem Council that was discussed in Acts 15:13 through 22. And Paul called James one of the pillars of the church, and that was in Galatians 2 and 9. So pretty much the scholars generally agree that James was the author of this. The other thing that we really don't see, and I really was fascinated about the scholarship on this, was that it was obvious if you read the original text in Greek that James was very proficient in the Greek language. And, they kind of surmised that, he had a relatively good education because of the quality of his writing and of course, obviously it was inspired, but the quality of his writing and the way that he chose particular words to get a particular meaning. And unfortunately, some of those meanings were lost when it was translated into English, and we really don't get to see the depth of the writing that he was doing. And there's a couple of different views to the time that this particular book was written. One of them is called the historical theory, and James wrote the letter prior to the Galatians controversy that's talked about in Galatians 2:11 through 14, but prior to the council there in Jerusalem that's discussed in Acts 15. There's another group of scholars that feel that this was written in response to some sort of letter that letters that Paul wrote, and they were kind of Paul had a tendency sometimes to get over people's head, and James was kind of cleaning it up a little bit and bringing it down to earth to get it to where people could understand some of the things that Paul was saying. And there's another group that said that the letter was recorded in Galatians and Acts, but is not a dialogue with Paul or anything that he does. And Josephus has some comments on here, and he commented in his writings that James was the brother of Jesus, and he also commented that he was killed in 62 A.D. during the high priest of Ananias when he was the high priest.
Josephus records what happened to James. Basically, he had angered the high priest and the various sects of Jews because he was pretty good speaker,
right,
and good writer. And it said that they basically brought him almost like his brother to a mock trial.
Mm-hmm.
And they threw him down from a high point of the temple and then stoned him. So he was martyred.
Right. So if you want to try to date this, the scholars kind of put the date on this particular epistle being between 45 and 48 A.D., somewhere in that in that time frame. And we know from history that this was a time of persecution, and this was a time where a lot of the Jews were scattered, and the Jewish Christians were scattered about.
At the time of writing also eliminates the apostle James because he had died before this
right.
was written.
So I mean, there's a lot of interesting stuff that's written about this, and there's it's generally viewed that this epistle was probably not written in the same format that the letters that Paul wrote, and that there's some of the scholars seems to think that this is a combination of several of the letters that he wrote to other people, and they kind of put it together in a not in a book, but in brought all the sayings and stuff in. One of the scholars said that the book of James looks a bit like the Old Testament book of Proverbs dressed up in New Testament clothes. There's a lot of wisdom and situations that James addresses that people commonly run into, and how that they need to how they need to deal with the situation. So its constant focus is on practical actions in the life of faith, and it's kind of reminiscent of wisdom type literature. Here's how you deal with these particular situations, not unlike some of the writings in the Old Testament. And if James did have a very good education, obviously he had studied the Old Testament and was probably very familiar with some of the writings there, and he used that same literary style to write this particular epistle. So the message of James is that those who have been truly saved through the gospel must manifest that salvation in practical ways in their life. In other words, you need to practice what you preach. And that was kind of the things here, and there's a lot of basically direct commands in pursuing a life of righteousness and holiness. And in some ways, it's a very blunt book. He doesn't make any excuses for somebody who doesn't measure up. He's pretty solid on this. And in the mind of the early church leader, Christians evidenced by their faith and by walking certain ways and not others. In other words, following the ways of God and not getting off the path. And for James, a faith does not produce a real life. A faith that does not produce a real life change is a faith that's probably not worth a whole lot. If you just kind of wander around all over the place, and when you become a Christian, it doesn't make a change in your life, then maybe there's some things that are short. So comments about any of that?
This was probably the first book written of the New Testament.
Could be very well that was mentioned too.
And James was supposedly an elder
Mm-hmm.
in the church in Jerusalem. There was a book written several years ago, for teenagers, about the book of James.
Mm-hmm.
It's called The Real Phony, Please Stand Up. And it's excellent reading
Mm-hmm.
as well. But that's basically what he's saying. You either are or you are not what you say you are.
Right. You is or you ain't.
A lot of church historians, excuse me, they talk about the body that James was part of. To us, they're the eldership at Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of them said it was a council. I think it's a very denominational.
Well, when I was reading about the Gospel of James, it initially, the way I understand it, was considered seriously for the canon, and the Catholic Church. There was a lot of things in the Catholic Church, especially about Mary, that they were really into big time, because the Catholic Church worships Mary just as much as they do just about anything else. And in a lot of these writings, there was a lot of information and stuff talking about Mary, and there's a theory out there that we really never know, that Mary was always a virgin after she had Jesus. She never had any more kids, which we don't know. It's not recorded for us. But it was kind of interesting to note that one of the ones that had a hand in getting the Gospel of James out of the Catholic Bible was Martin Luther. He didn't agree with a lot of the stuff that was in there. Of course, Martin Luther, he did a lot of things in the Catholic Church. He put nailed his demands to the door and all that type of thing. But I thought it was interesting that Martin Luther kind of played a part in getting that kicked out of the.
We need to also remember, just because it was written to the 12 tribes of Jews, it wasn't written only to the Jews.
Right.
Its doctrine applies to Gentiles.
Right.
There's a lot of people, as we'll get into James 2,
Mm-hmm.
say, oh, well, that's written to Jews or works based, but in Christ there is no Jew, no Greek, and there's one faith.
Right.
So it's like, that's something always important to remember.
Well, and in that time too, there was a lot. There was Jewish Christians. They were Jews before they were Christians, and that was the way it was back then. It was a different time. But you're right. The stuff that's in here applies to everybody.
Show you again a lot of how Catholic Church is glommed on to James, pretty little segment of the doctrine, and refer to him as the son of our mother, meaning Mary.
Mm-hmm.
Our mother.
Yeah, they're big into that. All right. So let's look at the first verse here. We're not going to get very far into this, but anyway, James, a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes which are scattered abroad, greeting. Are you getting ready to get up and ring the bell? Okay. Well, I'll talk fast. The epistle of James is not addressed to the assembly there in the church of the church at Jerusalem, and it does not take ground of the apostle's authority. He's not claiming to be an apostle. He's a servant of God, just like we are, and he's not claiming to be something that he's not. He's writing it, based on the wisdom that's been revealed to him, but he's not an apostle. And there's some of the writings, when you read this scholarship, they call him an apostle. He was not. James, the brother of Jesus, was not an apostle. You can call him whatever you want, but he wasn't. Okay, I'm gonna quit here, and we'll pick this up next week. Appreciate everybody's attention and comments today.
We'll carry him right there.
been preaching for 42 minutes, apparently.
You've done good.
Yeah.
Very quick.
Started